Ramsar Records, David Childers reteams with producer Don Dixon for Run, Skeleton, Run, coming May 5th. The lauded North Carolina singer-songwriter's latest effort features vocals and banjo contributions by Scott Avett of the Avett Brothers. Get your copy of David Childers' Run, Skeleton, Run on May 5th at ramsarrecords.com.
How many lives can one man live? As a writer, Neil Hanson has pushed conventional wisdom to its limits. Through his books, he's carried us along with the Spanish Armada. He's ran with treasure hunters, explorers, soldiers, and sailors. He's written beer guides, and for a time was the owner of the highest pub in Britain. As a member of the band the Avett Brothers, I was introduced to Hanson's work in 2003, while Scott Avett was reading Hanson's 1999 release, The Custom of the Sea. The book tells the tale of a doomed 19th century yacht and its stalwart and forthright captain, Thomas Dudley. After the vessel sank in a monstrous storm off the coast of West Africa, its crew clung to life on a 13-foot dinghy. What happened in the 19 days they were lost at sea became the talk of London and even caught the attention of Queen Victoria herself. This tale of perseverance and morality inspired our 2004 album, which borrowed its name from Captain Dudley's ship, the Mignonette. Last summer, I had the pleasure of finally meeting Neil Hanson. We sat down in the boisterous lounge of West London's famed K West Hotel. Ben joined us via Skype as we discussed how an honest enthusiasm and curiosity for life will take you everywhere.
You know, here at The Road to Now, our premise is that the personal narrative somehow fits into the larger historical narrative. Well, tell us a little bit about your upbringing and how you came to writing and how you decided to make a life out of it.
It's funny, I've had you couldn't even call it a career. I've had a really ramshackle life. I've done all sorts of incredibly stupid things. I grew up in the north. I went to Oxford University at a very formative time and went to a college that I was virtually the only northern grammar school boy in the whole college. Everybody else was what we call a public schoolboy here, what you'd call a private schoolboy. And that had traumatic effects on me, but was also a great launch pad for life. But I've been I've been a plasterer's mate, an ice cream salesman. I've owned the highest pub in Britain. I edited a thing called the Good Beer Guide. I've worked in art galleries. I've done all sorts of dumb stuff, and it's a disqualification for any other job you can think of except to be a writer, because writers draw all the time on their own experiences, and I've had a few over the years.
We need to introduce you to Governor John Hickenlooper of Colorado, another man that has also had a life like
checkered
yours.
past.
Yes, a checkered past for sure. So could you talk a little bit about your research and your understanding of the unknown soldier?
Yeah, that was a really intensely personal book for me, that, because like many people in Britain and America and elsewhere, my grandfather, or some people now, probably their great-grandfathers, fought in the First World War. And my grandfather was one of the guys who went over the top on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And unlike so many of his comrades, there were something like 56,000 British casualties that day, he survived, and he survived that and the rest of the war. And at the end of the war, he came home, took his medals off, put them in a drawer, and to my knowledge, he never, ever spoke about the war in the 50 years he lived after it. And when I spoke to other people, I didn't even know he'd been a soldier until after he died, and I was helping my mother clear his house and found the medals. And when I spoke to other people, you discover, and I'm sure your listeners and you can tell similar stories, it's a really, really common phenomenon. And I can't ask my grandfather why it was, but obviously it occurs to me, first of all, his experiences were so horrific. He just didn't want to put himself back into that dark place, even in imagination. But also, and I think people would confirm this, there's a general feeling that if you weren't there, you simply couldn't begin to understand what it was like. So why waste your breath in trying? So if you like, that was the starting point for my book on the unknown soldier. I wanted to know what it was about him, his experiences, that made him so silent on what must have been one of the seminal events of his life. And I was interested as well in the unknown soldier in Westminster Abbey, and you have the one in Arlington Cemetery, and there's an unknown soldier in virtually every country that fought in the war. And I was interested in who they were, why were they chosen, what did they represent, and that led me on to the concept for the book, which was to identify three unknowns, a Briton, an American, and a German, because I try and be even-handed in my writing. I don't want to do winner's history, you know.
Right. We try to be even-handed here, too.
Yeah. So I identified 3 unknown soldiers and tried to recreate their lives in the book. And at the end of the book, the payoff, if you like, is that each one of those 1 men represents 1 million unknown soldiers of all sides who have no known grave. So that's why the emotional resonance of those unknown soldiers when they were buried is so potent and so strong. Because for so many people, the unknown soldier was their lost son, husband, father, whatever. And the stories you move, we've all probably seen footage of Princess Diana's funeral, and we think that's the biggest thing that ever happened. That was nothing compared to the burial of the unknown soldier in London or the burial of the unknown soldier in Arlington, Virginia. They were just events that literally brought the whole nation to a standstill. So I wanted to tell that story and convey some of the experiences and some of the emotion. And, I make no apologies. It's often an emotional book. I shed many tears when I was doing the research for it, reading those incredible letters and diaries that people wrote then. And sadly, people don't do that anymore. If you try and do a book on the Afghanistan war, you will not have those rich resources to draw on. There'll be texts and there'll be tweets, but they won't be like these.
Right. I actually have for my class on World War I teach U.S. history. I have my students read journal entries from soldiers in during the wars to see what their experiences are like. As close as you can in a short class, but it's amazing. The insanity of war blended with the mundane, stories of just life and survival, and it's fascinating.
But people wrote such amazing letters, and these weren't literary men. These were just ordinary men, but they wrote the most incredible, moving letters. Often the last letters they ever wrote.
Reading letters from the American Civil War, here you have men that were clearly, like you said, uneducated, but their grasp of language and the tenor of the way they could write down their emotions and capture the moment and be so heartfelt. And like you said, for many of them, the last message they have for the world, and particularly for the ones that they loved, these men had no formal education. And I just cannot believe it. Like, we struggle in our time. It seems like we struggle in our time period to use eloquent language. We don't even struggle. We don't even try.
Yeah.
We don't even try to.
Yeah.
And these men were naturally eloquent. And what was it about their times that allowed them to be that way?
I don't know, but there's a quote from a German soldier, which is the foreword to my Unknown Soldiers book, and I probably read it 70 or 80 times, and it makes me fill up every single time I read it. I can't read it without a lump in my throat, because it is so brave, so compassionate, so dignified, and so moving, and I can't imagine I could write anything with a tenth of that compassion and dignity if I was in a similar awful position that he was in.
So let's talk about the Spanish Armada.
The Spanish Armada, again, I love the story of the Spanish Armada, and I do have a slight iconoclastic streak in me, and one of the things I've never really subscribed to the idea of good Queen Bess. Queen Elizabeth I is revered in Britain as this the finest monarch we ever had, and I think she was absolutely the reverse of that. I think she was truly, truly terrible, and everything her defenders say about her, they always say, she was a master at diplomacy, playing one side off against another. I don't believe that at all. I think she was just chronically indecisive. She could never make up her mind, and as soon as she did, she'd change it 2 minutes later. Famously, Francis Drake, who was waiting at Plymouth to set off to fight the Armada, there was one occasion when the Queen 3 times issued the order for him to set sail and then immediately countermanded it again. And when he finally got the order to set sail again, he just took off as fast as he could before. And yet again, yes, somebody was already riding from London to countermand the order, but by then he was gone. And she treated the seamen who defended her throne, who saved her throne, she treated them absolutely shockingly. She was appallingly tight. So she let these seamen go out and fight, and she was so tight that they didn't go out with enough gunpowder and shot. If they hadn't pinched some from the Spanish ships they captured, they wouldn't have been able to defeat the Armada anyway. And at the end of it, these seamen who'd saved her throne, they arrived back in Britain to find out that the Queen had decided she wasn't going to pay them, because why would you bother? The Spanish have gone. So they were just cast onto the dockside, absolutely destitute. And if people like Sir Francis Drake, Lord Hawkins, and the rest of the commanders hadn't dug in their own pockets and found some money themselves to pay them, a lot more than already would have died of starvation and disease. So I think, and her famous moment when she stands on the beach at Tilbury and rallies her troops to fight the Spanish was a fraud. She already knew the Spanish Armada was fleeing up the North Sea when she went down there, addressed her troops, and made her rabble-rousing speech. So everything about her, I think Bad Queen Bess is a much better description of her.
Throughout history, the men who fight the battles that save countries, that create independence, that save the world. If you think of World War II, they always get treated, the veterans always get treated terribly.
Yeah.
Always get treated. It happened in the American Revolution. Chronically. It was terrible.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, but make sure you get it in writing in advance, otherwise you're not going to get it. Yeah.
Yeah, and this all speaks to what you were saying earlier about the fascinating story of after the event, you know? The Spanish Armada, it's like we won, but what happened to the folks who fought it, you know?
Yeah. And there's always this thing, a lot of revisionist historians say, well, no, actually it was a draw, the Spanish didn't lose, but they misunderstand the nature of the British Navy then. These people were pirates. Their sole aim in going to sea was to plunder Spanish ships, and a Spanish ship at the bottom of the ocean can't be plundered, so it was never their intention to sink the ships. If it happened, it was an accident. They wanted to disable them, cripple them, tow them into port, and strip them of everything that could be sold. So once you understand that, then you begin to understand why it could be a victory, even though only a couple of Spanish ships were sunk during the engagement.
Yeah, and at the same time, the first colony, you know, the lost colony we know now, the Roanoke colony, is over in current North Carolina waiting for the British to come back. They never show up till too late.
Still waiting.
Still waiting. But the thing is, nobody knows. It's like the Roanoke colony wasn't like to settle. It was one of the big reasons was to plunder Spanish ships, set up a base for operations against them.
Yeah. That was the sole purpose of British foreign policy was steal somebody else's money. And nothing's changed in the intervening centuries.
all the talk of going to archives, you know, for people who are listening who aren't historians, visiting archives is an amazing process. It's like being a detective, and you stumble across papers, and there's that beautiful moment where you find the things that you've been looking for, and it makes your day, it makes your week, because you will spend some time going through some papers that don't work at all.
As somebody once said, 90% of research is wasted, and if you only knew which 90% when you started, you could save yourself so much time.
Oh, yeah. My dissertation research was done in 1920s Soviet-era government documents, and if anybody knew how to run a bureaucracy, it was the Soviets.
Oh, yeah.
Hundreds and hundreds of pages of just nothing.
You know, Neil, you've also done work helping other people write their books.
Yeah, I'm
ghostwriting.
A ghostwriter by
which
trade.
you told me can be a dirty word sometimes.
Yeah, I think people are very sniffy about it, and you know, sometimes with justice. But I think it's perfectly acceptable. I would say this, wouldn't I? But I'm going to anyway. I think it's perfectly acceptable that somebody's had an amazing experience or done something astonishing, and they don't necessarily have the literary skills to be able to tell that story as well as it could be told.
Right.
So that's what I do. I don't tend to work with too many celebrities. I don't tend to work with sportsmen very much because I have a very low boredom threshold, so I don't want to be writing the same book over and over. So I work mainly with people who've done something extraordinary, SAS men, pilots, explorers, adventurers, those kind of people.
You wrote a book for a treasure hunter.
I did, yeah, a treasure diver called Keith Jessup, sadly no longer with us, but he was an amazing character. He was a very abrasive character. He's a Yorkshireman like me, and he took no prisoners, and certainly had an ego to go with his achievement. But he was absolutely the poorest background you could imagine. He was born to a penniless single mother in a mill town in Yorkshire in the 1930s, and by the sheer force of his own personality and the sheer sweat and grit, he turned himself into the most successful treasure diver there's ever been in this country, at least. And the highlight of his career was lifting what was then about $45 million, probably now $500 million of Soviet gold from a British warship at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. And it was an astonishing achievement. It was the deepest dive using divers rather than mechanical grabs there'd ever been at that point. And he did it against all the odds, and he was a remarkable character. Whenever I'm in a bar and we get a glass of red wine in front of us, we always raise one to Keith. So here's to you, Keith.
By the way, we're in the hotel lounge that we're staying at. So, and in fact, there was a little altercation here a few minutes ago. I don't know if our listeners picked up on that, but.
Good cover. I'm in my home in Nashville, and I appreciate you telling everybody that did not occur in my home.
Yes, there were no domestic altercations in Ben's home momentarily. That was not trouble. No, it was all good. So tell us about your book, The Inn at the Top.
This is one of the many wrong turnings or right turnings I made in life when, just on a sheer whim, I was reading a newspaper one morning and saw an article about the highest pub in Britain needing a new landlord. And it's a ramshackle place. Its next door neighbour is 4 miles away, which in British terms is like 200 miles in America. And it's right on top of the Pennines, what pass for mountains in England. It doesn't have any main services, and it is the most extraordinary place with some of the wildest, wackiest characters. And you come from Carolina, you will know this yourself. When you go into the backwoods and the boondocks, you do meet these absolutely astonishing characters. One of our favourite locals at the pub was a woman called Faith, who was 84 years old, and she was brought up to the pub every morning in the post office van. And because there was no passenger seat, she lay on a pile of mail sacks in the back of this van every morning. It bounced and bucketed all over these rough roads coming up there, and she'd come staggering out of the van, come up to the bar and go, "Large whiskey and soda for the love of God," and chain smoke a few untipped cigarettes and then stagger off home again, and we'd see her again the next morning. And all the characters up there were like that. It was just an amazing place. And it wore me out, I burnt out after a couple of years, but it was the most astonishing place. And I've always wanted to tell the stories that went on there. Everything about the place was incredible. The police were supposed to raid us, but because we were so far from the police station and they didn't want to turn up any more often than they had to, they used to phone us up the morning they were going to raid us and let us know. So we were the only pub in Britain that was raided by prior appointment. So everything about the place is amazing. So I put together all those stories and told them in a couple of books, The Inn at the Top and Pigs Might Fly, which I don't think are available in the States yet, but you can probably get them online.
We're gonna make them available in the States.
Yes, we'll spread the story.
What an amazing personal story Monk Eastman has. Please tell our listeners a little bit about him.
The complete opposite of Tom Dudley in The Custom of the Sea is a gangster called Monk Eastman, who was a famous figure in New York's Lower East Side at the start of the 20th century. And there's almost nothing known about Monk Eastman, and everything he ever said himself was almost invariably a lie. Even the police, even the New York police who arrested him 30 times, never knew what his real name was, never knew what his address was. And for some reason, probably sheer stupidity, I thought, this sounds like a really good book to do. I'm going to set out and try and do it. This is around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And because he was in with Tammany Hall and he could get the vote out on election day, both real and fictitious, he was protected by the politicians. So he was a hugely successful gangster until eventually he overstepped himself. He got in a duel with some Pinkerton agents who were famously incorruptible. He went to Sing Sing for 10 years, and when he came out, the world had changed. Everything had moved on. And he was harassed and beaten by the cops who'd previously protected him. And in the end, he enlisted at the age of 44. He became one of the oldest doughboys to enlist in the First World War in France. And because if there was one thing Monk was good at, or certainly knew about, was being shot at and shooting people, he proved to be a highly successful soldier. And he came back. He was pardoned by the notorious New York governor, Al Smith. He was part of the ticker tape parade down Fifth Avenue after the war. And he seemed to have achieved complete and utter redemption. But, his end became a very murky one. He died on Christmas Eve in 1920 in circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. He was gunned down by a prohibition agent, and his story ended. But he then had, the most amazing, virtually a state funeral with all his wartime colleagues turning out, thousands of people from the Lower East Side attending the funeral. It's a fantastic story. I was convinced when I wrote it that Marty Scorsese would be beating a path to my door to film it, but hasn't happened yet. But with luck, he's watching this.
How did you...
The poor guy, he managed to turn himself around, and then Prohibition happened. I mean, if you've got an ounce of gangster blood in you, and at that point in American history, you're going back in it.
Yeah. He claimed he'd retired and was running a pet store in Brooklyn, but his landlady said that he slept all day and was out all night, which doesn't sound exactly like a typical pet store owner, does it?
A nocturnal pet store, maybe.
Yeah. Maybe.
How did you find Monk Eastman? How did you discover him?
There was a reference to him in Herbert Asbury's The Gangs of New York, which first intrigued me, and I started to do the research. And one of my best friends lives in New York, or on City Island, and Barry Fast, who I can give him a name check. And so I stayed with Barry regularly, and we talk a lot, and he's a great source. He's not only the perfect guide to where to eat in New York, but he's also a great help with research and so on. So I went many times to the States to do the research, traveled all over New York State, and plundered every archive I could find. And in the end, there was just about everything you could find on Monk Eastman, I think I found.
So where did you go first?
First of all, I went to the New York Public Library, of course, great start. Went up to Albany to the archive there. Went to the military archives in Saratoga Springs. Went to the Washington, D.C., the Library of Congress. Went to an archive out in Oklahoma City. Went all over the place. But he's such... The really intriguing thing, the thing that I love most about Monk, this is a very dodgy geezer, as we'd say in Britain, from start to finish. He had a sort of common law wife. And at some point, she may, or for whatever reasons, while he was away fighting in the First World War, she moved to the Big Bend in Texas, and apparently remained there. And his death was erroneously reported in the Big Bend newspapers. It was suggested that he died, and as far as I know, no correction was ever published. So I have this intriguing thought that she'd probably gone to Big Bend with all the money he'd accumulated from his life of crime, assumed he was dead and gone off somewhere else, and Monk Eastman probably spent what was left of his life trying to find out where his wife and all his fortune had gone. It's probably still out there somewhere.
I think we have a lot of Avett Brother fans who also enjoy this podcast. Would you say, Ben?
I think so.
And they'll be very excited to hear your story and the inspiration you've been to the Avett Brothers.
Well, it's one of the highlights of my life is that I've actually, in a very small way, helped the Avett Brothers, or slightly inspired the Avett Brothers to produce a record and, a great song. There are great hopes for what we might do with it in the future.
Neil, you were there was a time when we drove around in a van, in a conversion van, and we didn't listen to music. We talked a lot, and one thing we talked about were the books we read. And we were reading. And Jim Avett, Scott and Seth's father, is very into books about adventure and more so people who overcame incredible odds and were faced with events that tried their very soul and their very spirit. And one book that Jim passed down to Scott was a book called The Custom of the Sea.
Absolutely.
And it so inspired Scott that we titled one of our albums Mignonette after the ship that was the centerpiece of that book.
This story, the Custom of the Sea, is one that has probably stayed with me more than almost anything else I've ever written. It is the most amazing tale, and it's one of those stories, the deeper you dig into it, the more layers there are to it, the more dimensions there are to it. It's the story, basically, of a Victorian shipwreck. The ship called the Mignonette went down in a storm. The crew were cast away in a tiny dinghy with virtually no food or water, and they were cast adrift for 24 days. And on the 19th day of that ordeal, they did what many other seamen did in the 19th century. They killed and ate the cabin boy in order that they could survive. It was such a common place in the 19th century that it actually had its own name and its own set of rules. It was called the Custom of the Sea, and all seamen knew that if you were shipwrecked and you were in dire straits, what you did was draw lots, and then the short straw would be killed and eaten to preserve the lives of the rest. It's gruesome stuff, but it's absolutely true, and it was a very practical thing. Ships went down at an astonishing rate in the 19th century. Because of the way the insurance system worked in Britain, it was actually in the interests of ship owners to keep sending ships back to sea, whatever condition they were in. You could actually insure a ship for more than it was worth, so even if it sank, you still made a profit. Great news for ship owners, not so good for the poor souls who were on the ships. That was why the Custom of the Sea evolved, because not a single wooden ship in 20 years in Britain, not a single ship was ever sent to the scrapyard. Every ship, no matter how decrepit condition, was patched up and sent back to sea again. Just astonishing.
But Mignonette was brand new, you know? It was a new boat, and it seems like they knew there were problems with it before they took off, but they were kind of like, don't worry, we'll still make plenty of money.
Yeah, it wasn't quite brand new. It had been reconditioned. It was a sailing yacht that was being taken out to Australia for a rich Sydney sailor to add to his fleet. And it was a captain called Tom Dudley who was sailing it out there. Very, very experienced captain. And the astonishing thing the British Home Office, the arm of the government, had for years been looking for a reason to outlaw, to ban the Custom of the Sea. They thought it was an absolutely depraved and terrible custom. And they may have been right, but it was was a practical solution. And so they were looking for a test case. And the reason they picked on Tom Dudley and his crew was because Tom Dudley was an absolutely devout Christian and a completely and utterly honest man. He didn't think he'd done anything wrong. He thought it was a horrible deed, but one that was necessary. And so he freely confessed what he'd done as soon as he came back to Britain. And he put the pistol, if you like, into the hands of the British government, and they took aim and let fly.
And that is what inspired Scott, and so took us all about this book and this story, was that the captain said, we're going to tell the truth even if it hangs us. And I remember driving around in the van and him telling this story, and every day he would read more and tell us more. And it was that principle that we're going to be honest no matter what the consequences.
Absolutely, and he was probably the only honest man involved in the case, because in their desperation to uphold the law, the British establishment proved themselves perfectly willing to bend and even break the law themselves to make sure they got the conviction they were after, and in the end they succeeded. It was everything about it was illegal. If it had been appealed today, it would have been thrown out in 5 minutes. The court that actually, no jury ever found them guilty. In the end, a panel of 5 judges became both judge and jury, which, as you know, is an absolute anathema to a legal system. But they, first of all, they found them guilty, and then they sentenced them to death. So that was immediately changed to life imprisonment, and that was eventually reduced to, they served about a year before they were released.
You know, and that's something, reading about you and the books, that I knew you wrote The Custom of the Sea. I didn't know your catalog until I started looking it up in the past couple of days. And something about you is you like what happens after the event. Like,
absolutely.
You know, they were on the ship. They had to, kill the cabin boy. And but what happened after they got home, after they were rescued? A lot of your books, you take it from the moment after we would think the climax happened.
Absolutely. I think some of my best work picks up at the moment where other historians leave off. And it's true, the book I wrote about the Great Fire of London, which, like the Great Fire of Chicago, is something that still resonates down the years, about the Spanish Armada, and the book about the unknown soldiers at the end of the First World War, the one buried in Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, the one buried in Westminster Abbey in London. I'm really interested what happens when the parades are over, if you like, or when the shooting stops, what happens next.
Yeah, after, the happy ending. What
Indeed.
happens next? Because there's another morning after the happy ending.
And it's astonishing. I mean, some of the subjects I've covered, like the Fire of London, like the Spanish Armada, have been written about so extensively, you just could not imagine you could ever find anything new to say about it. But there's always a way, I think, there's always a way to approach stuff. And I found a really useful tool is to think, what modern knowledge can I bring to bear on these things, and what resonances do they have? And for example, the Spanish Armada, I went off and talked to coast guards and trawlermen and shippers, because lots of things change over the years, but human nature doesn't change. The seas, the tides, the currents, they don't change. And my best source, the Fire of London book I wrote, my best source of ever was a crematorium technician. I think he'd been doing his job 25 years, and nobody had ever asked him anything about the work he did before. And he told me stuff that flatly contradicted the textbooks that arson investigators use, and he proved to be absolutely correct. And what he told me gave me a new approach to the Fire of London, and answered some questions, in my mind anyway, that had never been satisfactorily answered before.
So let's follow that down a little bit. Can you tell us what questions you had and what he told you that set you in a different direction?
Well, my question initially was the simple one. How could it be that a fire that destroyed the entire city of London, a city built of wood with many streets no wider than an armchair, how could it be that only 6 people had died in this cataclysm that destroyed the city of London completely? And the answer is, well, there weren't any bodies, And what the crematorium technician said to me suggested that it was perfectly possible the bodies were there. They just weren't recognised as human remains because the temperatures were so intense, the fires burned over such a long period. And then you say, well, okay, maybe more people died, but why did nobody identify them? Why did nobody claim them? And the truth was, these were the poor. These were desperately poor people living in warrens by the River Thames in decrepit tenements that should have been pulled down 200 years before. Nobody cared whether they lived or died. And the whole of London was so devastated, it was like the surface of the moon. People who'd lived there all their lives couldn't identify where their street had been, let alone where their house had been.
Wow.
And 1/3 of London's population disappeared and never returned. And obviously, you know, most of those had simply moved to another area or emigrated. Some even finished up on Tristan da Cunha in the middle of the Atlantic. But among them, there could well have been hundreds, perhaps even thousands of people, the halt, the sick, the lame, who couldn't escape the flames, but nobody cared whether they lived or died. And, you know, I can't prove it, obviously, but it's at least to me a tenable hypothesis as the idea that just half a dozen people died in this cataclysmic fire.
Neil, are there any books that you started, stories that you began to track down, people that you began to investigate, that the trail went cold, or you found yourself at a different point in your life that you just kind of left it?
Yeah, I have a bulging unused projects file. There's an astonishing woman called Queen Emma of the South Seas. I make this as a gift to the world if anybody wants to write this story, in the 19th century, who has the most amazing story you've ever read. It is absolutely incredible. It starts on American Samoa. It covers the whole of the Pacific. It finishes up in a casino in Monte Carlo, where she apparently murders her husband so that he will die before her, because she doesn't want his family to inherit all her vast wealth. It's got everything you would ever want. She's one of the strongest and most extraordinary characters, and I'm desperate to write that, and I've tried to sell it to American publishers. I've tried to persuade British publishers, and everybody goes, oh no, people don't read books about the Pacific, which must be news to fans of James A. Mignonette for one. So that one's still on my to-do file, and I hope to do it one day.
Well, so do we. Ben, do you have any questions?
No, I just, I think it's interesting the comment, the book you didn't finish, or the project you didn't finish. I mean, I'm nowhere any close to as accomplished as you are as a historian, and I have a file of like ideas that I'm like, this would be amazing, and I get a week into it, and then something else calls, and you have to figure out what to focus on. It is sometimes the burden of being a historian is finding too many ideas and just not being able to get them all done.
But better that way than not having any, though.
Neil, yeah, someone would have to take off about 5 years of their life to read all your books.
It took me more than 5 to write it, so that's only fair.
Well, Neil, it's such a pleasure to finally meet you.
And me too, Bob. It's been great.
Thank you for inspiring us the way you have.
Oh, well, thank you. It's the bit of my CV I take most pride of in mentioning the Avett Brothers in amongst everything else. So it's been a real pleasure for me too. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on The Road to Now. Our program is produced by Bob Crawford, Ben Sawyer, and Ian Scotta, edited by Bob Crawford and Ian Scotta. Paul DeFiglia provides our music. Please be sure to follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and rate us on iTunes. For more information about this or any other episode, please visit theroadtonow.com. For Dr. Ben Sawyer, this is Bob Crawford. Take care.